but I think we misinterpret the concept of acceptance. But acceptance doesn't necessarily have to mean agreement. When the hand of death kind of brushes across your cheek and becomes much more real, I think that's often the turning point for some people. You know, happiness is a byproduct of discipline, and that seems sometimes counterintuitive, but for me, that's the way it works, certainly in my life. I started to realize that, I wasn't the only person in the world with a tough story, and that, over the arc of my life, I've been pretty lucky.
This episode is brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for businesses. If you have ever wanted to grow your business faster than what you can right now, if you need to make more revenue, if you need more leads, if you need more clients, if you need to know how to plan your business in a strategic way in order to hit big goals, if you need to learn how to scale your business and grow your team and your business so that you have more freedom, then this program is for you. Imagine 3 days immersed with me where we cover all aspects of business, but we do it from an immersive but also an execution standpoint. We execute every step of the way, and we're looking at 5 key areas. We're looking at your psychology, we're looking at your marketing, your sales, your leadership, and we're looking at your planning and how we integrate these 5 key areas to grow your business and your brand quickly. So if you'd like to find out more information, kerwinray.com.
So ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to Unstoppable today, Asher Packman. Great to have you here, Asher.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Mate, it is an honor. And as I was saying just before we jumped on, the Unstoppable podcast really is about, talking to those individuals who've had some pretty incredible stories that would, almost epitomize them as, unstoppable in nature. And, I know we've had you speak for our K2 Elites before, and you ran some meditation and some breathwork sessions for our K2 Elites, which has been fantastic. So I've got a little bit of an insight into your history and your background and what you've been through. But what I am curious to know, and I ask all my guests this, like when you're in a dinner party and there's, let's say there's 8 people around that table that don't know who you are, and someone asks you, so what is it that you do? How do you answer that question?
The honest truth is, mate, it probably depends on who those 8 people are,
That's what everybody says.
Look, I mean, generally it's going to be something around, health and well-being, or potentially, to be more accurate, around mindset. So,
and that's your jam. Like you're a globally recognized mindset coach, meditation teacher, but you've also, combined HeartMath with a lot of what you do and other philosophies and other lessons and learnings. So, what is it that you do? Like with what you offer to the world, what do you do?
Well, basically, I tend to kind of come from that place where people who've had similar experiences to me and have gotten stuck along the way, I find myself sitting in front of those people a lot. So I do private one-on-one sessions with people.
Yeah.
I also work as a meditation teacher through my studio down in Melbourne. And that can take the form of HeartMath, which we can talk about a little later in terms of how that specifically relates to meditation and meditation styles. But I also do a lot of work with men. So I'm working with men in groups. At the moment, a large chunk of my time is taking a big group of men through a kind of initiation rites of passage style course, which is over 8 weeks.
Yeah, right. And that's that kind of thing. It's interesting that the men seem to be more and more open, but also more and more open to the support that is required, when we look at things like rite of passage, because I think there's a lot of men around today who perhaps have come into the world, but they haven't really been shown how to do things, in a way that is healthy as a male. So, mate, as I said, your history is quite an eclectic one, and it's, for being a globally recognized mindset coach and meditation teacher, most people may not know where it all began for you, but where did it begin for you? Like, where were you born?
Yeah, I was born in Melbourne, pretty stock standard suburban Melbourne boy. Nothing too outrageous there. And then basically was living a kind of traditional life. Went to school, went to university, went and got a job, did all the things, and then had some big changes in my life, some massive shifts, which kind of caused me to really have a look at what I was doing on the planet and trying to make a bit more meaning out of my existence and the time that I had here. And as a result, kind of took a 180-degree turn from the corporate life, which was going well, as at least externally, and changed my focus to what I'm doing right now.
And so let's talk about what some of those things were, because you had a high flying career. What were you doing?
Well, at the end, I was basically working for, as it was then, AOL Time Warner. I was a vice
Yep.
president there, looking after communications. So I had a couple of regions under my belt. I was looking after Asia and Europe, and yeah, it was a pretty full on job. When I left there, I started my own PR agency, which became multinational pretty quickly, and things were going really well. Yeah, and yeah, I felt like I was able to make a success, on my corporate career, and I felt like things came, not easily, but I felt like I knew what I was doing. Yeah.
And what was the first thing that gave you a little bit of a nudge?
Oh, mate, specifically, and you know this story, so you know where I'm going. But yeah, I'm take myself back to 2007, and I was in Dubai, and I was literally about to get up on stage and speak at a marketing conference there, and had a phone call from my mum, and she told me that my sister had committed suicide, taken her own life, and from that moment on, everything for me changed. My younger sister, my only sibling, and yeah, obviously got on a plane and came back home as fast as I could, and from that point on, my life was just completely different.
And what was the shift that takes place? Because that's one thing that everyone is affected differently by different things. But it's interesting because I hear this time and again where people are affected by mortality and it makes them stop and it makes them think in different ways. So when you got that call, like it seems to me there was a significant shift that followed from that. But are you conscious of how that played out in your head?
At the time, I wasn't, but obviously looking back now, I can see exactly what you're saying, and it's quite interesting that you bring up kind of death as a turning point for some people. When you have when the hand of death kind of brushes across your cheek and becomes much more real, I think that's often the turning point for some people. And even looking at what's going on in the world right now, there's a huge part of that which I believe is kind of our relationship to death more broadly, and how we viewed that. So for me, yeah, in hindsight, absolutely, that was the point, where I guess I faced my own mortality in some sense through what happened to my sister, and I kind of turned the lens and started looking inside here about what it was, who I was, what it was that I wanted out of life, and what I could give to the world.
Was there an immediate shift in your behavior in terms of what your focus was? Because I know there was a transition at some point out of business. Was this what kind of led to you getting out of the high-flying corporate arena and into the mindfulness space?
That first incident with my sister definitely caused me to slow down.
Okay.
I ended up coming back home. I was living in Hong Kong at the time. But I still stayed in the business world more or less, but I definitely took my foot off the pedal. And so for me, it was kind of the beginning of what I like to call a conscious descent. And I believe that, everything in life, we're sort of taught that everything is up, aren't we? You know what I mean, man? It's like, success, ascension, up, everything needs to be up. And I think at some point in someone's life, you need to actually go in the other direction and build some deep roots. And if we don't do that work ourselves, then the universe kind of has a funny way of chucking us down that way anyway, through events, be that health or divorce or a bankruptcy or something like that, which causes us to turn the dial and look inward and go down for a while and perhaps feel grief and look at death and all these things which we tried to avoid our whole lives.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always look at these signs like feathers, bricks, and trucks. The universe will give you a tickle, and if you ignore it, it'll give you a knock on the head. And if you keep ignoring it, then it's going to smack you in the face. And to me, it sounds like this: when your sister passed, that was a little bit of that was more of a truck based exercise. But do you think you listened at that point, or was there still more to come?
Yeah, and look, I definitely like that analogy, and I can take it back even further because I'd felt this kind of, let's call it a gnawing sensation in my gut for a long time that I wasn't quite on my path, that things needed to be different. And whilst I was getting the success in the external world, there was still a part of me inside, and this is the feather,
Yeah.
There was definitely something that wasn't quite right that I needed to look at. But of course, the more success you get and the more the sort of outer world kind of validates what's going on for you, you don't tend to look at it, So yeah, I agree with you that obviously losing my sister, it was a very significant brick. But yeah, there was more to come, and as I said, I was still I still wasn't quite there yet, and I was still looking externally for validation and things like that. But I guess the next step in that process came in 2010. My mother, who'd been sick prior to my sister's passing, but was largely kind of in remission from cancer. After my sister passed, she became very, very ill. And in 2010, she decided to end it herself as well. Although obviously in very different circumstances from my sister, in the sense that my mum was extremely ill.
Yeah. Was it unexpected? Were you conscious of the decisions that she was making at that time?
Look, yes and no. It's difficult, isn't it? You sort of look back and it's yes and no. But yeah, I mean, look, she was very. I mean, her courage that she and her bravery that she showed, even getting to the point that she did, I was in constant amazement.
And what happened next? Like, because obviously this is in fairly short succession. What year was it when your sister passed? Was that?
Yeah, this was a couple of years later. Yeah,
a couple of years later.
And
so, when your mum passed, by this stage, had you exited the corporate world at this stage, or were you still hanging in there? And
I was hanging in there, and I'd sort of brought everything back to a much more manageable level. So I wasn't like flying around the world the whole time, and basically, it was in a much more manageable state. But around about 6 weeks after mum passed, I got diagnosed with a blood cancer. So that was kind of that was the moment.
It's interesting because there's some people at this point be going, "Fuck, when it rains, it pours, doesn't it?" But I guess from your but I guess from your perspective, these sounds like 3 back-to-back considerable challenges. How with the gift of hindsight, and a wise mind, when you look back on those situations that came to pass, like how critical were they on the journey, in terms of the journey, in terms of that intersection for you to be where you are right now?
Oh, completely critical. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's funny how we label things as good or bad, and then you sort of 10 years down the track, you look back and you think, well, if it wasn't for those things, then X, Y, and Z wouldn't happen, and you can't actually look at it as a bad thing anymore. You just have to see it.
Well, I guess that's where I'm going. So at the time, you get dealt this third blow. You've just been diagnosed with a rare blood cancer. At this point, like, are you entering the space of a balanced awareness and an introduction of conscious hindsight, or were you just like, what the fuck's going on? What did I run over someone in a previous life to deserve this, or where were you at?
Well, mate, we're getting into it now. The space I actually entered at that point, mate, was 4 white walls, because I ended up in a psych ward.
Wow. Yeah. Right. And what triggered that? Like, what brought you to that place?
Well, I think it was just overwhelm, basically. Too much happened in too short a space of time, and I had no resilience. I wasn't prepared for that. My life to that point had not taught me how to be, I guess, resilient to that degree. It was just too much too quickly, and my brain just couldn't handle it. It was that case of, when you say to yourself, I can't believe what's just happened. Like, I think I took that to the nth degree. I literally couldn't believe it. So everything just shut down.
And this is whilst you're in the early stages of the diagnosis for the blood cancer, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. And so how do you pull yourself out of this?
Yeah, look, this is when the work...
Because it's very fair to assume at some point that, there'll be a lot of people out there. It's like, I've lost sister, lost mum. I've now been diagnosed with a rare blood cancer. I feel like I've lost the plot. I'm now in a psych ward. I think a lot of people at that point would probably give up on everything. Why didn't you?
Yeah, well, I didn't, obviously, because I'm here now. I think for me, it was the very depth of that descent that I was talking about. And, I had an opportunity. It was almost like a blank canvas. It was like, all right, well, where to from here? Like, this is, there's certain aspects to this which you can't change. You're going to have to accept it. And that's a really interesting point, Kerwin. And I'm sure you've spoken about this before, but I think we misinterpret the concept of acceptance. I think, you hear a lot in the spiritual world, just accept, just let it go, all that kind of shit. And it's like, yes, absolutely. But acceptance doesn't necessarily have to mean agreement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So for me, it was like getting my head around the fact that I accept this has happened. I'm not okay with it, but I need to accept that it's happened. And those are kind of two, that was a big turning point for me to kind of understand that.
And so what did that turning point look like? Was it while you're actually still in the hospital that you started turning it around for yourself, or did it take a little bit of time and a bit of distance before you started to, feel yourself pulling it back together?
Look, there was definitely times. I mean, it's a really odd feeling, man, when
Yeah.
I mean, I remember how I had such resistance going, even going into that place. There was all this. I guess maybe it's part of this self-reliance that men tend to particularly men tend to value so highly. It's like I remember being at the front desk and filling in the form, and everything in my head was just shouting at me, going, "You don't need to be here. You can pull yourself out of this hole." But then there was another deeper part of me saying, like, this is going to be good. Like, there's almost like a rest from the world right now.
Yeah.
But it's a strange feeling, when they take away your shoelaces and take your belt off because they're worried that you're going to do something. And having my family history meant that every single red flag in the book was was
Was already
lifted,
triggered.
was raised for me, because it was like they didn't have to look too far to see what the trend was. Um, so yeah, but in that place, man, it was deep reflection to begin with, and deep sorrow, and deep grief, and a lot of tears, for sure.
And so how did you start to pull yourself out? Like, what was it that gave you the sense of, okay, I can get myself out of this. I can see light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, you know what it was, man? There's a lot of people in that place. You spend a lot of time eventually, after spending a fair bit of time self-reflecting, like um, listening to other people, and sharing some stories with other people that are there in common areas. And I started to realize that, I wasn't the only person in the world with a tough story, and that over the arc of my life, I've been pretty lucky. I'd lived all over the world. I'd done these amazing things, and seen a lot of success, and loved, and been loved, and all these things. And sure, this was a shocking place for me to be in, but I wasn't the Lone Ranger.
And at what point did the mindfulness enter the world?
Yeah, look, I think then my mum had that about her. She was into the Kundalini yoga, and lots of meditation and lots of other stuff. So it wasn't like it was brand new to me. She lived in Byron Bay for a very long time, and had all the, had all that kind of stuff going on with all her friends in the community up there. So for me, that wasn't foreign to me, and I guess I was just naturally drawn to it. And it was indicated that it would be a good idea even in the psych ward.
Yeah, right.
So I spent a bit of time just kind of, I guess, sitting with myself, which eventually kind of became meditation. It wasn't like I hadn't done it before either. I had dabbled in it over the years.
Okay.
And then HeartMath came in along the line. I think I was just reading something about it, hearing something about it, and it seemed to make sense to me. Also, I'm sure you're aware of guys like Bruce Lipton.
Mm-hmm.
So Bruce was talking about, the way he does about epigenetics and things, and I was making connections back to my cancer. And I started thinking, is there a story I've been carrying around that led to the manifestation of this physical disease? And by the way, I think I know what that is, the
Yeah,
story.
right.
And we can talk about that at some point for sure. But as I was listening to Bruce Lipton and others speak about this, I realized his connection back to HeartMath, and I kind of, just kind of followed the thread, and that's where I ended up.
So for people who perhaps don't know what HeartMath is or aren't as familiar with it, what is HeartMath?
HeartMath is about, I guess, the heart is the most powerful organ in the body, and it sends the most signals to the rest of the body than any other organ, much more so than the brain. And this idea that if we can have a nice aligning signal between our heart and our brain, which I'll call coherence, that we can make a huge change in terms of, it's almost like flow state,
Mm.
and a lot of great things can happen at a physiological level, but well beyond that as well. And so getting into that coherent state it's a form of meditation.
Did you find HeartMath help take your meditation to another level?
Yeah, definitely. It was definitely the beginning point for me, because I think a lot of what I'd been doing in my life is just building up walls around my heart.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think what this whole process did for me was just smash down the walls.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
I don't think any man in the country can relate to what you're saying. I was very grateful. I came across HeartMath, gosh, I think it was 05, 06. I was introduced to a little bit earlier, I think, when What the Bleep first came out in the early 2000s. And I still remember hooking myself up to the HeartMath software to be able to recognize when I was in coherence. And when I did that, I then proceeded to wear a laptop for the next 3 months, about 8 hours a day, because I just wanted to see when I was in coherence, when I was out of coherence, and what were the correlations, and just get really familiar with what coherence feels like. Because I think it's much like, meditation. Most people don't know what it feels like to be unstressed. And so they just think stress is their normal baseline. And so when they do start to feel relaxed, in some cases, they feel like there's something wrong. And it was interesting. When I started doing HeartMath, I experienced the same thing. I noticed that when I was in coherence, it felt very unusual. It didn't feel normal. And it really, the software gave me a real unique opportunity to just be able to sit in the space and visually see that I'm in coherence. But then I guess you could say kinesthetically really start to tune in and go, right, what does this actually feel like? And it was a huge help for me, not just in my meditation practice, but more so in my day-to-day conscious, mindful practices. So from your perspective, like, what have been some of the biggest benefits that you've received as a result of, becoming more aware of the alignment between the heart and the brain and creating that coherence?
Yeah, look, I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's kind of understanding what it feels like first, isn't it? Because I know in my life, it's definitely a family trait to be anxious and these types of states. And so for me, that was kind of my normal. So to understand what it felt like to not be that way. And I think you're right. I think it's true for almost most people. Whether they're in the parasympathetic or the sympathetic, it's unusual for them to feel relaxed. And often you'll say perhaps they're sitting at home watching TV and plus on their phone at the same time, and all these different things going on, and in their brain they're saying, I'm relaxed. There's no way. There's no way. This is me relaxing, sitting on the couch.
Yeah.
And there's no way you can be in a relaxed state with all that stuff going on. So I think you're right.
At what point did you enter into the realms of not just being a meditator and practicing HeartMath, but actually becoming a teacher in this space?
Well, the interesting thing was, and I'm sure people will resonate with this, is as I started to change and as I started to kind of be more aware of myself and started to become myself, I guess you could say in some senses, I found that people were starting to ask me questions, particularly guys. And in the end, I kind of was almost informally kind of teaching them HeartMath and talking through my experiences and feeling that they were resonating with that. And maybe, they were leaving conversations with me perhaps better armed for life than they were previously in some small sense. And I started to feel like this is my calling. This is what I need to do. And so shifting away from what I was doing before and more into this.
Was there a moment when you realized, holy shit, this is, because I'm going to assume with the career that you've had, you would have had many moments where you're like, oh my God, I've nailed it. I am a success. I've created what I want. Then you go through this, incredible transition. At what point do you remember the point where you're like, shit, this is not just something I want to do. This is something that I actually want to do. This is going to be my business.
I don't think it was a specific light bulb moment, but it was more of an organic process. But there was definitely a moment when I kind of looked back over, say, a period of time, 6 months or a year, and thought, I have been doing this, and it feels awesome, and I want to continue in this direction and expanding and widening and growing in this direction, because it just feels right on all levels, like at a soul level, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'd never experienced that feeling before, where when you get up in the morning and you're just like, I am doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing.
And at what point
go
ahead.
I was just going to say I'd never felt that before, so it was extraordinary. And once again, it kind of cycles back, because it's like, well, I need to be on the planet. And so, because this is what I'm giving. This is and so it kind of like it's self-fulfilling.
And when did breath work enter your life?
Breath work came in. It was sneaking in just through various forms of meditation and so forth. But the big moment around breath for me was being introduced to the Wim Hof method.
And for those who perhaps aren't as familiar with breath work as perhaps we are, how would you describe breath work to anyone who's not familiar with the concept?
Well, I mean, it simply begins with simply focusing on the breath and working with the breath and understanding that everything begins from that point in terms of how you're showing up, and it completely changes your state, resets your brain. I mean, Kerwin, where do we start with that, brother? It's like,
well, and this is the beautiful thing, because there's so many benefits. And when you look at what you do, and this is where I'm kind of culminating here, it's almost like you've worked out, because to me, I'm a performance obsessive, right? And if there are 4 things that I've identified that have been absolute critical factors when it comes to maintaining high levels of performance, meditation's number 1. If I'm not meditating every day, I can't perform at a high level. And the second one would absolutely, undoubtedly be HeartMath, because for me, flow state is critical for me to maintain, the performance and the speed that I run it. And so, HeartMath plays a huge part of my life. And then looking at breath work, for me, that's been so incredible, not just as a tool for resetting the autonomic nervous system when it's out of balance, when we are in stress, to be able to do it quickly, but also to be able to, in some cases, release trauma and release, energy and emotions that have been trapped in some cases in my body for extended periods of time. There's one other thing I'll throw in there, which you're probably going to tell me that you do anyway. It's intermittent fasting. And if you get those 4 things together, you get those 3, but those 4 things together, it really does weaponize, the human capability. And I say weaponize in a peaceful way. But from your perspective, you've come from an environment that would be considered high performance in the corporate space. But now you're playing in I guess you could say, a high performance conscious space. How different is your life now versus what it was going back when you were that corporate high flyer?
It's completely different. I mean, I'm not drinking and doing other things. And my relationships with myself, my relationships with people. I mean, literally every single building block of life is probably different from the way it was then. I still have friends, great friends from those days. Beautiful. So maintaining those relationships has actually been key. But at a base level, everything's changed. And to talk about those 4 things which you mentioned, I mean, I knew I liked you, man, because that's exactly where I'm at. It's exactly where I'm at. And I didn't come to it. I mean, it kind of came, as I said before, a little bit organically. Yeah. I was just kind of following a thread,
Yeah.
And if it made sense, then I'd bring it in. I wasn't kind of, and that's where I've ended up. I mean, there's a couple of extra things on top of that, which I do as well. But by and
what else do you do?
Oh, and I'm sure you do too. These are just kind of, they're almost like subtitles underneath those 4 things. Like things for me, which are ultimately important, is journaling, for example. Yep. And just this kind of idea across all of that, this idea of ritual and discipline and making everything sacred, like I get up at a certain time in the morning and I kind of have my rituals in place. And these are all kind of what I call sacred acts, the meditation, the journaling, etc.
So what does a day in the life of Asher look like? Like, what are your routines within your routine of a day?
Well, in the beginning, the beginning point is just that, it's getting up, pretty early, 5 or 6 in the morning, hopefully 5 if I'm on my game, and sitting down to meditate. Even making a cup of tea is one of those things becomes sacred.
Yeah, right.
And then sitting down and doing some journaling. And then basically, the meditation would include some breath work. So it's kind of a combination of, and then some form of movement, and that's basically it. And then I begin my day. But it has to start that way, and that's my time, And I've got a little 5-year-old, so if that means getting up way early, to make sure that that's all done by the time he awakes, and that's basically what happens. And I think that happiness is a byproduct of discipline, and that seems sometimes counterintuitive, but for me, that's the way it works, certainly in my life.
So now with what you do, I'm going to assume that you work with a whole range of different types of people and characters and calibers. Do you see a consistent issues being echoed, at all levels with the people that you work at, and when it comes to, what is it you do? What are the biggest problems that you find yourself solving?
I could answer that through talking about the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell. I think our lives may seem very disparate, and we all have these different stories, but there's kind of a thread which runs through all of our lives. And I can say, let me speak about it for a second, purely through the lens of men, given kind of where my head is at the moment, because I'm running this course at the moment for guys only. But you get all these men together in a room, and when we start talking, we find that almost 99% of their lives are exactly the same. It's just fill in the blanks. And there's this been idea, as you said, about putting walls up around the heart, as you agreed with, and then at some point in their life, something has happened and it's kind of knocked them off their perch. And it's often at that point that I get a phone call. So and when I look around the room, I'll see a bunch of guys where everything's been fine until it's not, and the dial's been turned inwards, and they realize that something's been wrong for a long time, and they need to look at it. And if you look at, for those, I'm sure many people will be familiar with the hero's journey. That's the way it works. We're kind of called into descent, called into the abyss to go and look and face our own mortality. And it's in that place when we actually enter the descent through our wound. That's how we find our gift, and that's how we find the gold that we can then return and be of service to the world. And that's the arc of my life.
Yeah, right. You talk about rite of passage and working with men on creating a rite of passage and the rituals that I'm going to assume that are within that. What does that look like? Obviously going back to when we lived in a more of a community, tribal, family orientated environment, a rite of passage was a lot more evident, especially in other cultures. In Australia, we don't have a very strong set culture. We're very multicultural, I guess you could say. And so most people's form of rite of passage is schoolies. When you work with someone on rite of passage, or when you talk about this concept of rite of passage for a man or for a masculine, like what does that look like?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say schoolies, because, having lost this idea of a rite of passage or an initiation for boys to become men, it has become that. And literally it's been boys initiating boys, hasn't it? Which is kind of what schoolies looks like. And to some degree, if there's no elders around, it's people that don't know much teaching people what they know, which is not much.
Yeah, right.
And so that's kind of what schoolies looks like, So I think there's probably a distinct lack of elders around now, like true elders. And I think that a lot of older men, myself included for a while, like I'm over 50 now, but it's like it almost feels like you become an elder just by right of your age. And that's obviously incorrect. Like you've got to earn that place, and you've got to want to take it on. It's got to be proactive. I was listening to, do you know Stephen Jenkinson, the Orphan Wisdom? He's a very beautiful man who talks in this space a lot. And he was saying that a lot of older men will say to boys, respect your elders. And he was like, well, be respectful. And then I'll respect you,
Yeah.
and he feels that there's a bit of that missing in the world. So I think one half of the rite of passage is for a boy to actually find elders that can take him on that rite of passage. And I think we need to remember is that's generally speaking not your father. You need other men.
Yeah, right. And so when you're working with men, you're obviously working with them at a stage of life where they're well beyond what would be considered the normal time to take a rite of passage, I'm going to assume.
Well, I think there's always time.
Yep.
And I think that it's different these days. I think, a lot of men, I think, are finding that place where something happens to them, maybe around 35 or something like that. Is what I see. I mean, that's very general. It could be anything, but that's generally what certainly I'm seeing. And these days, the rite of passage can often be as simple as coming together with a brotherhood of men, like and sitting and actually talking about, hey, what's going on for you, and actually letting down those walls a little bit. Often that sort of healing space of a bunch of men sitting together and doing that work is the beginnings of a rites of passage and initiation in itself, because I think a lot of men don't feel that they have permission to do that. They haven't given themselves permission to do that.
Actually, I was going to ask, why do you think that is?
Oh, look, I think it's what we've been taught. This is the information that we've been handed down. I remember listening to an elder. He was a Native American Indian speaking about this, and he said that the three curse words that a lot of American boys hear from their fathers is "be a man."
Ooh.
And I was like, wow, that's really impactful, because there's so much loaded in that around, don't cry and, don't show your emotions and all these sorts of things. And if that's how we're defining being a man simply through those three words, then it feels like we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So what's next for you, Asher? You're still on your journey with your treatment, I believe.
Yeah, although look, it's an interesting one, man. I mean, I think I'm lucky in a sense. There's so many worse varieties of cancer one could have. I kind of joke and I say if you could put your hand in a bucket of cancers and pull out the one that I had, you'd be pretty grateful.
That's a great perspective. And so, what does that look like for you, mate? What does treatment look like for you? What does self-care look like for you with where you're at in your journey?
Yeah, look, it's, you know what, man, it comes back to those 4 things that you said. I just,
Yeah, right.
I just need to look after myself, and I just need to, be careful with my energy, and just, it's just about, the logical steps that one should take to stay well. I mean, it's really interesting. I think to myself that the life I was living before, and not doing all those healthy habits, potentially getting cancer might prolong my life because of the changes I've made,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
That's so interesting. I was only thinking about that this morning. I've had a pretty hectic couple of, I think everyone's had a pretty hectic couple of months, couple of weeks. And I started thinking a couple of days ago, man, I just don't feel myself. And then I looked at it as, well, first of all, let's look at what are the routines that make me feel good. And at that point, I've been on holidays for a week and I hadn't meditated in like 5 or 6 days. I haven't exercised at this point now in like 3 or 4 months. And I just started again looking at my little routines and my little rituals. And I was like, and it took me less than 3 minutes to go, okay, I now know why I feel the way that I feel because I'm not engaging in those routines that make me feel better. But there's a level of awareness that I think is required for people to get to that point where they're willing to take responsibility. What do you think prevents most people from developing the level of awareness that's required for them to, take that level of ownership and accountability around their own situation? Because I'm sure you see it with what you do. There's a lot of people that are in situations, and when you get into it, it's very extrinsic. Well, I'm here because of this. I'm here because of that. And it's very, very rarely is it internal. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to people building levels of awareness that enable them to own more of their shit?
I think it comes back down to story. It's like these stories that you've been telling yourself, and they've become completely programmed into your life because we're just meaning making machines. We're just basically a bunch of stories, all of us. And if you're not looking at those stories and understanding what it is that you're kind of telling yourself on a daily basis, I don't think you're going to be able to get there. It's like for someone who's trying to lose weight, for example, there's probably a story in there which says I'm a fat person or I deserve to be fat. And I would argue that there's almost nothing that person can do in order to keep the weight off until they actually change that story. I had this story because I'm 6'6" and I'm a fairly skinny guy. Like I spent a lot of my life with a story that I was skinny, right? And I'd argue that if I went to the gym and pump weights every single day, I probably wouldn't put on that much muscle. It would just get leaner and leaner and leaner because that's the story that I've told myself about my body. Like I'd get stronger probably, but the muscles probably wouldn't. It would just be lean and strong because my story is I'm a skinny person, and it comes back to my cancer. And I can briefly touch on that if I've got time. But around
Sure.
the story that the story that I feel that I'd been telling myself from a young age was around protection, and that I needed to protect myself and protect others from the outside world. And that was very clear through my childhood that was something that was what I thought was required. And so obviously with what happened with my sister and my mum, there was a sense of failure that I wasn't able to protect them. And so this story that I've been telling myself about being protector, but I guess when that story is going through the body responds by overprotecting. And if you look at my cancer is actually overproliferation of platelets in the body. And what do platelets do in the body? They protect.
Yeah, they protect you.
So for me,
Wow.
yeah, huge, right? So for me, staying well, a large part of it is undoing this story of protection that, can't protect everyone. And actually, sometimes it's unhealthy to protect people too much from stuff that they need to have happen in order to grow.
Especially interesting when you look at the possibility that the cancer is even prolonging your life based on your previous lifestyle in a very unusual way. It could be perceived as a form of protection.
you could do that. You could take that leap. But for me, it's about it's simply about retelling that story, and changing that perspective, changing that viewpoint, and weaving a story which is more helpful, and gets rid of all those self-limiting beliefs.
So you've got a 5-year-old daughter, is that right?
5-year-old son. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's his name?
Jack.
And so I dare say you're in a new phase of life now. This is your first child?
Yeah, it is. And think about the fact that like he came into the world after I got diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, wow.
So there's
Has it changed your world? Considerably?
Man.
Considering like all the aspects of your life, everything that you've been through, where you're at right now, there's got to be a level of acceptance, but also a level of attachment around life, especially this new life that's come into yours. Yeah. What's it like being a dad?
Yeah, like everything, man. I mean, you talk about life. Everything's a double-edged sword, light and dark, whatever you want to say. But it's like for me, it's like what a reason to stay alive. But but also how hard will it be to say goodbye? Because the likelihood is that or not, who knows? But my life could be shorter, and as could anybody's though. Isn't that the whole point?
Yeah.
Like you know what I get people saying to me, Kerwin, all the time. How does it feel knowing you've only got a certain number of days left to live? And I'm like, you tell me.
Like a dude, you tell me. Yeah, exactly.
They go, yeah,
I'm probably going to live longer than you, buddy.
Yeah, it's like this idea of terminal. Like we're all terminal, brother. Let's
Humanity is a terminal condition.
100%.
So, one of the things that's become really prevalent for me, being a dad over the last 6.5 years, is really becoming conscious of what I'm leaving behind, and not so much in the form of, wealth or material. It's really in the form of, like a legacy. I'm curious from your perspective, you've been through a lot, in your life. Are you at the stage now where you're starting to think about what you want to leave behind, what that legacy looks like?
Yeah. It's actually the word that's been floating around in my head a lot. So you pulled it out from there. Yeah. The word legacy, because I think certainly, as I said, post 50, you start to think about, what mark are you leaving in the world after you're gone. And I think that's a big part of the journey for me right now. And I'm certain that what I'm doing now is going to be much more impactful on my son and others than what I was doing previously. But at the same time, I certainly wouldn't throw out that stuff either, because you need that. In some sense, let's look at it through this lens. If I hadn't of say been as financially successful as I was through that part of my life, then I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now to the same degree, because there was less pressure on having to make it work financially. So it's all stepping stones. Yeah, it's all in perfect balance, and it's all stepping stones, and you need all of it.
So for people who want to find out more about you, Asher, the meditation, the HeartMath, the breath work, where can people find out more information about you and what you do?
Probably the easiest point is just, my website, asherpackman.com. So from there, everything else kind of, all the coordinates are there, brother.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put a link in below so everyone can find it nice and easily. But Asher, thank you so much, mate. Thank you for coming in and for being candid and sharing your story. I know it's not necessarily going to be an easy story for anyone to share, but especially for those people who are listening, it's gonna pull on a few heartstrings. But I appreciate you going there, buddy.
No, man, I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Asher Packman, and this is Unstoppable.
This episode was brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for business.
There you have it, guys. Thanks for tuning into Unstoppable with me, your host, Kerwin Ray. And please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you get to see all of these interviews in the flesh. Share this podcast with your friends and drop me a review on iTunes. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also let you know that your comments help make sure that we keep producing killer content just like this. And if you'd like to stay up to date with all of my movements, upcoming podcasts, events, and much more, please jump onto the website kerwinray.com, and also check us out on all social media on the handle @KerwinRay. Thanks for joining us.